If you're aiming to harvest your own delicious homegrown fruit right from your very own backyard and skip as many mistakes as possible, then this video is going to be perfect for you. After over 10 years of growing fruit trees, these are mistakes that I don't see talked about enough.
About 10 years ago, I started growing fruit trees here in my suburban block in Perth, which is about a zone 10B, both in the backyard and in the front yard. I've been converting my lawn into an edible food forest so I can go outside and pick fruit 365 days a year. And over the last 5 years, I've been sharing videos and helping other gardeners grow their own food at home. And so I'm excited to share some costly mistakes that a lot of people make when starting out with their fruit trees so that you don't have to learn from them the hard way. And make sure you stick around to the end because I'm going to be sharing some tips on dwarf, semi-dwarf and standard citrus trees that a lot of people make and you may not have a clue at all. If you have any questions or you've also struggled with any of these in your own garden, leave a comment below and let us know your experience. You may have some valuable advice for other gardeners growing fruit trees at home as well. Buying a bigger tree to save time and be able to get fruit faster sounds like a good idea, but it can cause a few issues. Larger, more mature fruit trees from the nursery are not only more expensive, but often they have been sitting around in pots for far too long and their taproots are wrapped around the pots. Mature fruit trees can get you fruit much faster. Often in the first year, they're already flowering and fruiting, but in the long run, you can actually be worse off. Some of those fruit trees are already 10 years old, and fruit trees have a lifespan. So some fruit trees live 10 to 20 years, others 30 to 50. And that sort of depends on the variety and the rootstock that they are on. So if you're already buying a 10-year-old tree, it won't have as much life left in it as if you were to buy a younger tree. Another issue that you can run into with mature fruit trees is you haven't had control over the pruning from a young age. So buying a young fruit tree, you can cut it off exactly where you want it to start branching out from and start pruning it and training it to grow perfect for your spot in the garden, whereas a mature fruit tree, you're relying on someone else to do that. And although they may look really lush and beautiful in the nursery in a small pot, that's probably because they have been hammered with fertiliser. So if you see fruit trees that are just looking incredible in the nursery and then you take them home and wonder why they're not doing as well at your garden, it could be because you're not keeping up with the intense fertilizing regime that a lot of nurseries use to keep their fruit trees looking really lush and beautiful in small pots. Something that may surprise you as well is some mature fruit trees are grown in the ground and then dug up, repotted and on-sold. So their tap roots may be cut off, a lot of their roots may be cut off. You're just not going to get the best quality as you would with a smaller fruit tree that you can raise on your own. Another common mistake is not removing the label on your fruit tree when you plant it. I know I've done this too, thinking there's plenty of room, I'm not going to suffocate the tree and I'll remove the label later on, but so many times you can forget, or your tree grows really fast, which is a bonus, and you can end up choking the fruit tree and stopping the nutrients being able to flow up and down the stem. So what I do when I first get a fruit tree and I plant it in the ground is that take the tag off, tie it around your stake, so that way it's not going to restrict the growth on the fruit tree and it gives you a little bit more time to sort out what you're going to do with your labeling system. Which brings me to another mistake, is not labeling your fruit trees or having a labeling system at all. Mine is that I remove the tag so I'm not choking the tree, I pop it onto the stake beside it, and then I also have a list on my phone of the varieties and things that I've planted, as well as a map of my garden where I've decided to plant it. And the reason that is so beneficial is because if your tree dies a year or 2 years down the track and you can't remember which one it is, it could be a really costly mistake because some fruit trees need pollinated pairs, so you need to have 2 types for them to pollinate to get lots of fruit. And if one of your pollinator pairs dies, but you don't remember which one it was or don't know which one it was, it's going to be harder to replace that. And so the tree that's left behind may not fruit or may get really poor fruit set until you figure out which pollinator you need to get for it. So having a labeling system, whether that is writing down the varieties on your phone, so then you've got like at least a 50-50 chance if one of your 2 dies, you know it was either going to be the Granny Smith or the Royal Gala. And even better is creating a map so that you know where those fruit trees are and which one it was that died. Another mistake that I often see people make is trusting that the nursery is selling you exactly what grows in your climate and in your garden, and that's not always the case. Some nurseries will stock what is available to them, what they can purchase from wholesale, and also they may service other areas quite far away that have a different climate. So for example, in Perth, some nurseries will be selling stock to people that live in Exmouth and in Esperance. Because there's not a huge amount of nurseries available in those areas, people will often travel to Perth to purchase. And even small distances can have very different climates. What grows in the Perth Hills compared to what grows on the coast is going to be very different because of the chill hours. So just walking into a nursery and trusting that everything in there is going to grow in your garden can be an expensive mistake. What I suggest is to figure out what you want to grow, do a little bit of research online before you hit the nursery, and then you have a clear idea of the varieties that will work in your garden, that will have the right amount of chill hours, if there's anything special about them. What I do is I keep a list in my phone as well, in the notes, of fruit trees that I want to add to my collection, and I've done a bit of research on them, and I know that I have high chances of them growing in my garden, and that way when I am out at the nurseries I have that list on my phone, and if I see something I'm like, oh, will that grow in my garden, I already have some of those listed. Because not only do some nurseries not have people that can help you, but I wouldn't completely trust everything that someone tells you in a nursery, because they have to deal with a lot of plants. They can get things wrong, and it can be a really costly mistake if you do plant something that isn't going to grow well in your exact climate. So doing your own research is a must. And talking about doing research and figuring out what fruit trees grow well in your garden, figure out if your tree needs a pollinator pair. So some fruit trees need 2 different varieties to help with cross-pollinations to actually get fruit. This can really confuse people. Things like plums, pears, apples, a lot of those are not self-pollinating and they need a pollinator pair. They may produce fruit on their own, but they may be smaller, they may not be as many fruit on a fruit tree. And it's not just 2 random different plum trees. They have to be flowering at the same time so the pollen can be crossed over. So that doesn't take long to research online. If there's one plum that you really would like to get, then you can just search up what the pollinator pair is. Often a lot of fruit trees will have a pretty universal pollinator. So for apple trees, Granny Smith is often a really good universal pollinator that flowers at the same time as many other apple trees. With plum trees, like things like the Santa Rosa are also a good universal tree. But it is really important to just take a quick look online and see which ones are going to work for your fruit trees in your climate. And not all fruit trees need pollinator pairs. Quite often your nectarines and your peaches don't, citrus don't. It just depends on the fruit tree. So decide on what you want and then just take a quick look online. Now this is probably one of the most common mistakes I see people make, and it's not understanding rootstock on a fruit tree and figuring out where the graft is on your fruit tree and where the rootstock is compared to your tree, and not maintaining it from a young age. So when you get a fruit tree, it's important to have a look on the stem and try and figure out where the graft line is. You can often see the bark is different. You can maybe see a shape where it's been cut in and grafted on, and anything below that you want to make sure you remove any growth, because what happens is a lot of people will get a young fruit tree, just plant it and let it be, and the rootstock will start growing from the bottom of it, and it's much more vigorous than your grafted variety, and it can take over the tree. And rootstock that takes over the tree produces little to no fruit. Often it has thorns. It can sometimes have different shaped leaves, like in citrus it often has 3-pronged leaves. In stone fruit sometimes the leaves are red, depending on the type of rootstock that's been used. So it can look a little bit different and make it kind of easy to tell, but the longer you leave it, the harder it is to tell. And what happens if you don't remove those rootstocks is that it will overtake a tree and sort of kill off that fruit tree that you bought. You may have bought a blood orange tree, but you've accidentally let the rootstock take over, and now you have a really spiky bush lemon in its place. The best advice is when you purchase that tree and it is grafted, just take a look at where the line is on the tree and always just keep the stem clear. If you're not quite sure if the branches are coming from the graft or from the fruit tree, I would just remove them anyway, because often that's pretty low down and you want to keep the trunk nice and clean and clear. Another is planting fruit trees that you don't even like to eat. And this sounds obvious, but over time that tree is going to produce more and more fruit. And if you're not going to be utilizing it, you don't want it to go to waste. I have a tree like that. One of them is a mandarin tree, and neither of us really like to eat mandarins. This one also is a seeded variety, so it has seeds in it. It's taking up valuable space and nutrients, and it's not really getting enjoyed to the fullest. So That's something I think that gets looked over. Something that we do eat a lot of is bananas, and I didn't plant bananas for a long time. So now I've got a whole bunch of different banana varieties because that's a fruit that we really do love to eat. Another mistake a lot of people make when they're first starting their gardens is to get cheap soil. It is a costly venture starting out with fruit trees, buying the fruit trees, buying the soil, buying the mulch, setting up your gardens. It can be really expensive, and so I can see why people will try and go a little bit cheaper on the soil, but it is so important to get quality soil. Anything that you bring from outside into your gardens has a risk of having any contaminants. So these are things like pesticides, and if you do get cheap soil that has pesticides or plastics or rubble in it, that can be something that takes years and years to get rid of. Any pesticides overspray can cause your plants to get all deformed. It's often called killer compost, and people don't know about it until it's too late, where they get a trailer load of soil and set up all their gardens and fruit trees, and then they start to see some really weird deformed looking plants growing out of it, and at that point it's going to be a very hard and expensive process to get rid of. So just be really cautious about the types of soil that you're bringing into your gardens, and if you're going to spend all of that money on these fruit trees, don't skimp out on the soil. It's better to get less soil and get quality soil, and then work on ways to add nutrients back into the soil and into the garden by things like composting, worm farms, chop and drop, mulching, all those types of things. So don't feel like that you have to go out and buy tons of soil to get started. You don't need a lot, but you do need to make sure that it is quality. Now, this is a mistake that I made when I was first starting my gardens, and it's treating every tree like an individual and not like a collective. I started out planting a couple of fruit trees in my hot front yard without any support, anything around them, and they absolutely cooked. The apricot didn't grow at all in a year. It basically went downhill and just was getting worse and worse until I ended up taking it out, putting it in a pot, and just bringing it back to life before I had a plan and started to bring together my edible food forest. Plants by themselves without any protection around them really struggle in a hot climate, and we have high winds, hot, dry summers. So I think it's really important not to treat a fruit tree as an individual, but think about it as how it works as an integrated part of your garden, taking into consideration the future size and shade that your fruit trees are going to make. Now, I have a lot of fruit trees in a small area. I have very high density fruit tree planting, but I have thought about those things, and I do have plans in place for the future growth of my garden. So behind me here I have a mango and I have an avocado, and over time those are going to get bigger and bigger and cast more shade. So it's important to think about where in your garden you want future shade, and this is particularly important around things like your annual raised garden beds. You don't want to be planting too much that's going to block all of the sun. This is where deciduous fruit trees can come in handy, because you can plant them and they will have leaves to give shade during the summer, but in winter they'll lose their leaves and add more light. So being quite strategic and just thinking about that fruit tree and where it's going to cast its shade and for how long it's going to cast its shade is quite important for the future success of your garden. So I will link my video on edible climbers for you so you can check that out, because it's definitely a missed opportunity that a lot of people don't think about. Not pruning fruit trees when they're young can cause many issues down the track. As your fruit tree gets older, you're not going to want to cut it off at all. And in a small garden, you want to utilize every piece of real estate. And so I like to have my fruit trees pruned really low. I want the first branches coming out at about knee height or even a little bit lower, so that I'm starting to get fruit really low down and I don't have 1.5 meters of trunk before the tree even starts, because then I'm going to have that tree a lot taller to be able to get a decent amount of fruit. So having things pruned really low down is great for urban gardens, but it often means that you do have to sacrifice the first year of growth by cutting it very low, which can be scary. And so a lot of people don't do that. For example, this peach tree, it has got branches coming out down here, which is about a foot from the ground. I'm going to be able to pick fruit from right here all the way up, and so that way I can keep my tree pruned nice and short but still get a lot of fruit on it. And talking of pruning, another mistake I see is that people are too scared to prune at all. So pruning a fruit tree isn't going to kill the fruit tree. You do have to be quite strategic about it, and just do a bit of research on the types of trees you're pruning before you prune them, and learn what time of year is best to prune them. For most fruit trees, it is just after they've finished fruiting, but not all fruit trees should be pruned the same and at the same time. But by not pruning a fruit tree for years and years and years, it can end up so big that you can't reach the fruit, the birds eat all the fruit, or the fruit drops, or you get fruit fly, or you can't net the fruit. And then once the tree just gets so big, most of the tree is huge amounts of old branches that are super thick that aren't producing fruit. All of the fruit is really up high. So what happens is that after years and years of not pruning, you have to get you have to pay for tree loppers to come in and cut that tree right back down, which is costly. You're also sacrificing your future fruit for the next few years as that tree grows back. So don't be afraid to prune. And that also comes back to not spending a huge amount on fruit trees at the start. If you were to spend, like my citrus trees, I spent $30 on. I bought a really small tree and I pruned it from a young age. But now, like my mandarin, I don't really love the fruit, and I'm not terribly upset about removing that tree because it cost me $30, maybe 6 years ago. I've definitely got my money's worth out of that tree. But if I was to go and purchase, a mature tree for $350, of course I'm going to be really nervous about pruning it. I'm probably not going to prune it, and I'm going to end up with a less desirable tree than if I was to just get a younger one and not have that much stress involved in hacking it back. Another mistake that I nearly made, and I'm so glad I didn't, was going all in at the start. When you start doing edible gardens, you get very excited and you want to have all the things. I started off with small projects and made sure that I completed them before moving on to the next. So I started with my privacy hedge. I then added 4 raised garden beds. I added my little mini wildlife pond, and just took projects one at a time and made sure that I finished them and they were looking really good before I moved on to the next one. The thing with going all in and getting very overexcited is that you don't finish projects, and then things get overgrown, and then you don't really like them, and then you're ignoring them and you're procrastinating, and you're like, there's so much weeds or rubble and I just don't even want to look at it. So it can really put you off and you don't enjoy it as much. So I highly recommend starting small. Don't go all in at the start. Tackle one project at a time. And the other reason for this is that your gardening style might change. So when I first started my garden, I was really obsessed with these raised garden beds and I loved growing annuals. But over time, my passion has changed and now I love fruit trees. And if I'd gone all in at the start and added way more raised garden beds, I wouldn't have the space to play and experiment with all the different types of fruit trees that I'm now growing in my small garden, because I would have run out of space. So leave yourself some room to play, to experiment, and try not to go all in too heavy at the start. Another problem that can come with this is if you do go all in at the start and you haven't quite worked out your sun and shade and climate, you can realize that you've ended up putting things in the wrong place, or just you could have put it in a place that has done better. So it's better to make those mistakes on a smaller scale than your whole garden. So I highly, highly recommend tackling one project at a time and getting it up and running and really enjoying it. A mistake I did make when I was first starting my edible gardens was thinking too much about the future and not planting because of it. So when we first bought our house, I didn't plan on being here for a really long time. I was hoping to have it as a starter property to move on and be able to get acreage further down the track. So some of my dream fruit trees like mangoes and avocados, I didn't plant because I thought I'm not going to be here to enjoy them. And I did end up getting some over time and keeping them in pots, thinking, I would be moving on to the next place. I can take them with me, which is great. You can definitely do that. But 10 years down the track, I haven't moved, I'm still here. And if I had planted those, I would have 10-year-old mango and avocado trees producing some delicious fruit right now. So instead, I have planted them in the last couple of years. So we will be waiting a few extra years on those. But if I could go back, I would definitely have planted my dream fruit trees at the start and not worried too much about the future. I could have been a lot more generous with my planting and planted for those in the future just as much as for me. All right, let's talk about watering systems. Now, watering your fruit trees is very important, and a lot of people go wrong with this. In hot summers, it's really important to water your fruit trees less often, but really deep watering. So this means leaving the water on for longer on the fruit trees so that it soaks down, so that their roots will go down deeper to find the water. Having a little bit of irrigation often means that the water stays on the surface, so the roots stay on the surface. And you want those roots to get down deep to create a strong, secure tree and be able to find water on their own. Fruit trees are very clever and they're going to keep their roots where the water is. So if the water's always really shallow and in that first inch of soil, of course your roots are going to be there because they're going to want to get that water, which means your tree can overheat because the soil is going to be a lot hotter on the surface, and also they're not off looking for their own water source. They're just relying on you, and you don't want your fruit trees to just rely on you, because if something happens and your water system breaks or you go away, then the chances of your fruit trees dying is a lot higher than if they had strong, deep root systems that were watered deeply. Forgetting that fruit trees actually need to be fed. You can't just plant them, set and forget. I mean, some you can, but the quality might not be there. So it is important to think about how you're going to feed your fruit trees. And for me, I like to do things all natural. I'm not putting synthetic fertilizers on my fruit trees. I'm utilizing things like chop and drop, composting, worm farms to have more of a slow, sustainable growth without any nasty chemicals. So what that means is that I've had to plan for that, and I've had to think about that because I've got now so many fruit trees. I'm still working on this. I definitely don't have enough support plants growing, things that I can use as chop and drop and as mulch to feed my garden and build layers and layers of good soil and healthy microbes. Another mistake that people often make is just pulling out weeds and not looking at them and not observing them and trying to figure out what they're telling you. All weeds have a story, and things with big long taproots can mean that your soil is compacted. Grass often means that there's too much light and not enough fiber and organics in the soil. And then there's some other really spiky looking weeds that I know grow in very dry soil. So I know that my soil is too dry. And again, same if you start seeing mushrooms popping up, often that means that your soil is quite wet and doesn't have good drainage, or that it could just be that you have a lot of good organic material, but it is something to check that you do have adequate drainage, because mushrooms do like a really damp, moist environment. Expecting instant results. So growing fruit trees is a game of patience, and you can't expect instant results all the time. You're going to have failures in the garden, and you're going to have to wait and be a bit patient with them. We already get to take shortcuts by using grafted fruit trees that flower and fruit a lot quicker, but it is important to still let the fruit trees develop and give them time, and not be too worried and too stressed if you're not getting instant results. Because then what happens is people try to overcompensate and throw a lot of fertilizer or things at them to try and force them to grow faster, and yes, that may work, but then you might have limbs breaking because you've got too much fruit and your tree isn't big enough to support those fruit yet. So I always try and just let nature do its thing, because nature knows a whole lot more about growing than I do. And a mistake that you don't want to make is copying someone else's garden, because you're not going to get the exact same results. You have a very different climate. Even someone, a few streets away from me is going to have a different climate depending on, the orientation of their property, surrounding shade, big trees, even wind can make a big difference. So it's great to take inspiration from other people's gardens, but always have a think about how that's going to work for you, for your lifestyle, for your property, for your climate, and not just take what you see online as this will work for me, I'm in the same area. This is one that a lot of people make mistakes on, and that is not understanding rootstocks. Whether that is a dwarf, a semi-dwarf, or a standard, they all have different pros and cons. So dwarf fruit trees, especially dwarf citrus fruit trees, they are going to be a lot shorter, and you're not going to need to do as much pruning, which is a great benefit, but it is going to restrict the growth. Dwarf fruit trees are grafted onto a rootstock that isn't very vigorous. It grows really slowly, it absorbs nutrients at a slower rate, and it doesn't get as big. So that means that the fruit tree is not going to grow as fast. It's probably not going to produce as much fruit. It will still produce fruit around the same size. They are all going to be the same variety, because that's something else that confuses people, is they think that the dwarf version is going to have miniature fruit. Dwarf Granny Smith, a semi-dwarf Granny Smith, and a standard Granny Smith are all going to have the same Granny Smith on top. It's just going to be the amount of growth that the tree can do based on the roots. So yes, a standard Granny Smith is going to grow a lot faster, be able to produce a lot more fruit on a tree than a dwarf, but it's still going to be basically the same fruit. The other thing that people don't realize is that dwarf fruit trees have a shorter lifespan because of that restricted growth. You may have to replace your dwarf fruit trees a lot more often than you would with a standard, but it is harder to keep a standard nice and small in an urban garden. They do want to grow really vigorously. They do want to get nice and big and tall. So I find that a happy medium is a semi-dwarf. I love a semi-dwarf if possible. I do utilize mini dwarfs in my garden because I am growing in a small space. I also have so many fruit trees that growing dwarfs and semi-dwarfs means I have to do a lot less pruning. If they were all standard fruit trees, I would be constantly having to keep them small and keep them pruned. About understanding those different types of qualities that come with the different grafted rootstocks and figuring out what's going to work for you in your garden. Holding on to plants for fear of failure or guilt. If a fruit tree isn't performing in my garden and I have done everything that I can, I'm not going to keep it there forever. It's got a shelf life, like my passion fruit. I did everything I could possibly do to try and get that to fruit. I had bought a plant from a nursery and it ended up being not what I purchased. I wanted a purple passion fruit and it ended up being a gold passion fruit, which I don't mind. I love a gold passion fruit. But after 3 years, it still had produced 2 fruits, no matter what I did. And I have other passion fruits that are growing really well and producing a lot of fruit. So out it came. I'm not going to waste any more time fluffing around with something that is just not going to grow. It could have absolutely nothing to do with me. It also could just be it wasn't the right spot for it. So I think it's important to try and problem solve and work out what's wrong with your fruit trees, but also at the same time not investing for years and years on something that is just not going to work. They have to prove themselves, especially in a small garden. I don't have room to have all these fruit trees that just aren't working or that I don't like the fruit. So I think it's really important to continuously edit your garden and analyze what's working and what isn't. Although we do need to be patient with fruit trees, certain things like a passion fruit, it has a 7-year sort of lifespan anyway. So I'm, wasting 3 years of that not getting any fruit and just getting this really vigorous overbearing vine that I'm constantly having to prune back. The same with my lemon tree. My lemon tree produced some amazing fruit, but over time the citrus gall wasp, which is a really big problem here in the suburbs, was becoming unmanageable for me. I was having to prune the tree back constantly. It was just too much time and too much effort for something that I just didn't really care that much about. So out came the lemon tree and I put an avocado in its place, and now I have a dwarf lemon tree in a pot. Always analysing things in your garden and just working out, is it working for you or is it not? Because you want your gardens to be enjoyable. I want to go outside and be excited about everything in my garden and not just have things that are problems or causing me stress and wasting my time. There are plenty more fruit trees in the forest. I hope you enjoyed this video. If there are any of these problems or mistakes that you want more information on, let me know in the comments because I can do a whole video on those as well.